A year and a half ago, in your first interview for Hromadske, it was a year and a half, when you first just came from Kabul to Kyiv, you said that there are some similarities between Ukraine and Afghanistan, and you mentioned that the most significant thing is that both countries are facing the challenge of significant reforms during the time of the military conflict. How much progress did Ukraine made during this time?
If I think about everything that's happened in the last 2 years, it's really quite impressive. A land reform was adopted, which is now being implemented. There was a very important banking law which made the nationalization of Privatbank irreversible. We have an ongoing decentralization reform, which I think is one of the most important reforms taking place in Ukraine, which Sweden strongly supports. We've had important setbacks, such as the decision by the Constitutional Court back in October to dismantle important rule of law institutions. I would say that as challenging as the environment is, as difficult as it is, I believe that Ukraine remains on a reform path, and that is something that Sweden will continue to support.
And at that time, as far as I remember, you noted also that corruption, fundamental corruption, was also the common problem for Ukraine and Afghanistan. From this point of view, from this place where are we now, is it also improving somehow?
Well, I think I think you're right in the sense that it's difficult to see any clear-cut developments in the last, say, 2 years in the field of anti-corruption. And here it is unfortunate that the main objectives of the Ukrainian leadership has been focused on restoring the damage that was done back in October 2020 rather than in moving forward. But nevertheless, we have the high anti-corruption court. We have anti-corruption institutions that the government is now working to rebuild after the blow that they were dealt back in October. So I think that it's important to see the fight against corruption as part of the wider reform agenda.
Do you feel in your daily work nowadays, for working for 2 years in Ukraine, that you're working in a country that has a lasting military aggression? Do you feel it, and how?
Yeah. I feel it in different ways. I mean, first of all, yes, obviously I feel it. And I feel it most strongly when I visit either Eastern Ukraine or when I visit the administrative boundary line with occupied Crimea, because then you actually see the Ukrainian territory, which is currently under occupation, as in the case of Crimea, or you see the territory which is currently outside government control, as in Eastern Ukraine. So that's the most obvious place that you see it. You also see it when you consider all the human suffering which these conflicts cause, and especially during the year of pandemic, when the illegal armed formations in Eastern Ukraine and the Russian occupying forces in Crimea have used the pandemic as an excuse to restrict the freedom of movement for Ukrainian citizens within their own country. And this is, of course, something which is painful to see, and which is, again, a very, very strong manifestation of this ongoing armed conflict. But in addition to that, I think it is also important to remember that the Russian aggression against Ukraine is not limited to their support for the illegal armed formations in Eastern Ukraine or their occupation of Crimea. This is, I believe, a hybrid aggression whose fundamental purpose is to prevent Ukraine from fully deciding on its own future.
Swedish model of combating COVID and without strict quarantine restrictions was something strange, maybe something weird at last spring. That was also highly discussed. And now, to sum up, can we make some take out of it? Was it efficient enough, and was it successful? And what are these experiences that Ukraine perhaps should have borrowed of it and didn't do it? How do you see it now? I
mean, first of all, I think it's important to note that the differences between how Sweden handled the pandemic and how many other countries have handled it are not as big as we sometimes imagine. Restrictions were there in Sweden that were very similar to restrictions in most other countries. Because of the way our legal system looks, those restrictions were introduced as recommendations rather
not
than
obligatory, something obligatory.
Exactly, rather than mandatory. First one is that, as in many other countries, COVID really tested the state institutions, the organizations that we have to deal with crises of this nature, and it also tested the political processes in the country. And I think one experience in Sweden is that our institutions proved capable of dealing with the crisis, and the decision-making process, which leads to political action in Sweden, also proved to work. The institutions did what they were expected to do, and the way the decisions were taken were all in line with what they were meant to look like. So that's one experience. The second experience, if you look at public opinion, is that trust among Swedes in their institutions, trust in the ability of institutions to tackle this pandemic has remained quite high throughout the pandemic. In
this point of trust, it seems to me there is a pretty big difference in Ukraine and in Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for instance, if you look at vaccine hesitancy, my impression is that it's more widespread in Ukraine than it is in Sweden. And I'm not a sociologist, and I don't know the reason for that, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are a few things which come into it. I mean, Ukraine is a relatively young country. Ukraine has been an independent state only for 30 years, which means the political institutions, social institutions are also quite new. And you know, trust takes time, so I think that might be one part of it. Another part of it might be you know, traumatic experiences of abuse of power in Ukraine's 20th century history. But I also think that it is important in this context to speak about corruption. I mean, I think I imagine that a state where corruption is widespread has a more difficult time building trust in its relations. What
is the main ground for these investments? That has to be, previously it was a transparent and understandable legislation, and Ukraine's government's efforts of tackling corruption. You mentioned in the beginning of our conversation that Ukraine is doing some steps in this direction. So is now this ground, these fundamental issues, are they improving that is also helping to invest more safe for Swedish companies?
Look, the corruption and the problems when it comes to the rule of law is still the number one thing which is preventing Swedish investors from coming to Ukraine. This is absolutely clear. And here I fear that there simply are no shortcuts. You know, there are many good initiatives, but at the end of the day, this is not about special economic zones. This is not about setting up parallel jurisdictions and bringing in, you know, British corporate lawyers to deal with issues that the Ukrainian legal system is having difficulties to deal with. This is not about investment nannies. This is about building a judiciary and a rule of law system in Ukraine which is efficient and which delivers.
Having some political will to do it.
And of course having political will to do it. So this is, I believe, still a major impediment to Swedish investments. We do have a number of Swedish investors in Ukraine, and they're doing, many of them are doing extremely well in IT, in energy, in agriculture, in many different fields, in retail. So it's not as if there are no Swedish investors in Ukraine. It's just that there would be so many more, I believe, if these issues were dealt with in a more effective manner.
Returning back to the issue of climate changes and tackling climate changes, how do you see from the Swedish point of view, how is Ukraine now, on what stage is now Ukraine in this issue?
Well, I mean, to start with political will, my impression is that the Ukrainian government, in its partnership with the EU and EU member states, has made the European Green Deal a real priority for the relationship. So as far as I can judge, my impression is that there really is political will on the Ukrainian side to tackle climate change in close partnership with Europe. And this is something which Sweden very much welcomes. Of course, we know that hydrocarbons and nuclear still represent a big part of the energy mix in Ukraine, but we see a lot of investments also in renewable energy. We have Swedish companies, among others, who are investing in wind. There are important important investments happening in the solar energy sector. We know that Ukraine has not least for wind power, some really remarkable conditions in southern Ukraine, in Kherson Oblast and other parts of southern Ukraine. Another problem is that Ukraine has a very serious challenge with dealing with the legacy of coal-fired plants and the coal industry in various parts of the country, including eastern Ukraine. That is something that's a challenge which will have to be dealt with irrespective of climate change, because most of these coal mines are no longer profitable.
Then you mentioned about this EU and Ukraine cooperation, and concerning political questions, I cannot ask you about the Nord Stream 2. As in one of your recent interviews, you mentioned that Sweden feels that EU needs to have some stronger common approach to this issue. What do you mean with that?
So Sweden Sweden is of the opinion that Nord Stream is not only a bilateral issue between two countries, and it's not only a commercial project between two companies.
Do you feel this political tone of it? And
absolutely. I mean,
but at the same time, Sweden allowed to continue this. Yeah.
So Sweden had to decide whether or not to object to the construction of Nord Stream through its economic zone. Now, when doing that under international law, there were certain considerations which we could take, and we could basically decide whether this project was acceptable from the environmental point of view, and we could demand certain actions on the part of those building the pipeline in order to give them permission to build in Swedish economic zone. But according to the Swedish understanding of the international law, which applies to the laying of pipelines through the economic zone of other countries, we simply didn't have the legal tools to say no to the project. The only thing that we could do was to scrutinize the project from the environmental point of view and demand certain changes in return for our permission, and that is what we did. But it's not the case that it was ever in Sweden's power to stop this project, legally speaking. And of course, we need to
sure. I just asked about this subtle balance between the political tone and some economical things, because it seems to me that from the beginning, not all of the countries countries declare that they understand this political influence that may come to Europe, to EU this pipeline.
For Sweden, it has always been for Sweden, it has always been absolutely clear that this project is not purely neither a bilateral nor a commercial project. This is a project which has serious security implications, and it's a project which has serious implications not only for the European Union and its member states, but also for close partners, and most important of those is Ukraine. Now, Sweden very much regrets that it was not possible for this decision on Nord Stream to be made a European decision. And I believe that there is now a strong responsibility resting on Germany to ensure that Nord Stream 2 doesn't have serious damaging implications for Ukraine.
And also I'd like to ask you concerning this recent visit of Ann Linden to Ukraine. She said that Sweden surely is for the full implementation of Minsk agreement and the negotiations, the most efficient negotiations in the Normandy format. Ukraine is now in a search for some new formats of cooperation with international allies.
The Minsk agreements were established at a time when Ukraine was in an extremely vulnerable position, when its security was being seriously violated by the Russian Federation. So I think, you know, everybody can understand that the Minsk agreements are a frustrating and difficult framework within which you know, to try to achieve peace and conflict resolution in Ukraine. That doesn't mean that greater involvement by other stakeholders might not be welcome. I think US involvement in peaceful conflict resolution in Ukraine is something which would be very widely welcomed. And I think there's no contradiction between that and maintaining the Minsk agreements. The one doesn't contradict the other.
Several months ago, President Zelensky hinted that he would like to ask people about the Donbas issue on the referendum. Do you think that is something adequate format for such discussion?
You know,
the future of the whole region.
That I would comment neither one way or the other today. What I will say about referenda is that as democratic as they are, they have one, as I see it, they have a number of challenges. And one of those challenges is that you separate decision-making from accountability. When you elect a government and entrust that government to carry out certain things, by the end of its term, voters then have a chance to hold that government accountable for the decisions it's made and the way in which it's tried to implement them. And then you have elections, and then that becomes a verdict on that government, and that's how political accountability works. With the referendum, that mechanism no longer exists. It's impossible to hold anyone accountable for the decisions of a referendum.
By the way, we mentioned Ann Linde, the foreign minister of Sweden, and she's also the representative of the idea of feminist foreign policy of Sweden, and it seems to me that it's an important question nowadays in Europe. And especially in northern countries, the tradition of Sweden is also followed now by Finland, the empowerment of women, the women on the highest positions in the country. How far is nowadays Ukraine from Swedish model, if we can say?
I don't know how far Ukraine is from the Swedish model. I'm not sure that there is a Swedish model for gender equality. Okay. I think each country has its own challenges, but I think also every country in the world, and that includes both Sweden and Ukraine, still have a lot of work to do before there is equality between women and men. And this is an objective which we very much share in Ukraine. Now, important things are happening in Ukraine. The Rada recently adopted a law on paternal leave when children are born, so that it's not only the mother who takes paternal leave, but also the father. It's a first step. I believe that
for Sweden there is no surprise.
For Sweden there's no surprise, but you know, we began this 30 years ago or something like that I mean, today we have a system in Sweden where legally speaking, the father and the mother have shared responsibility for parental leave, and in reality it's we've also come quite far in terms of fathers taking responsibility for parental leave, but we've come to this point after decades of hard work, and this is a journey which Ukraine is only just beginning, and the first step was recently taken. I think that's an extremely encouraging step.
And with in some of your recent interviews, you noted that for Sweden for Swedish politics there are some two basic values. This is the rule of law and this free media landscape. With this, concerning these issues, how is it in Ukraine nowadays?
The first thing I would say is, Ukraine has free media, but the playing field is not always as even as we would like it to be, and I think there are a few things there worth noting. One of them is the disproportionate influence of oligarchs on the media landscape. There is a very high level of ownership concentration. And I think there are some very well-founded fears that this economic influence is used for political objectives through media ownership by oligarchs. So that's one issue. Another issue is that the institution of public service media is still very fragile in Ukraine. We have a public service broadcaster, Suspilne, and they're doing a fantastic job, but from a very, very vulnerable starting point. And I think Suspilne will continue to need both financial and political support for many years in order to really establish itself as a source of impartial news in Ukraine. You also mentioned safety for journalists, and I think this is part of a wider picture, which is about safety and security for those who expose corruption. And I think this is an issue of absolute importance, not only because it's a question of fundamental decency and human rights and protecting the lives of citizens, but also because Ukraine won't have a truly free civil society or truly free media until as long as working as a journalist or a civil society activist is connected with physical danger. Yeah, hopefully that's gonna change. Yes. But I like your optimism in many of the questions. Yes. No, I'm optimistic about Ukraine. I think it's a fantastic point. It's also a question of believing in a place and sort of and I very, very much believe in Ukraine. And that's absolutely great to hear. And what are the main things you love about Ukraine over these 2 years? In some interview you noted that cuisine, Ukrainian cuisine, yes, is your favorite. I really, really like Ukrainian cuisine. I think it's really, I mean, for me it's still a mystery. I mean, only as recently as I was in Lviv earlier this week for the jazz festival, and I was having lunch with some friends, and again we were talking about this question of Ukrainian cuisine, and one of the people at the lunch, a Ukrainian friend, said, "No, we don't have any great food tradition in Ukraine," and it's such a mystery to me, because for me it's so obvious that Ukraine really has a wonderful cuisine. You have some of the best agriculture in the world. You have the best. It's about underestimation. It's underestimation. It's absolute underestimation. And I think this is actually a wider issue in Ukraine. Is that I have the impression that a lot of Ukrainians don't fully value all the great things in this country, and I think that's a huge untapped potential.